Hello, and welcome back to the Sun and Moon Sober Living podcast. For those of you who are listening in for the first time, welcome. My name is Mary Tilson. I'm a holistic recovery coach and yoga and meditation teacher, and this is an inclusive space where we explore the topics of addiction recovery, mental health, and holistic sober living. Before we get into this episode, I wanted to share about our brand new membership platform. This is an online space for those who are sober and sober curious to access resources and be part of a supportive community. So if you're interested to find out more, be sure to check the show notes after the episode where you'll find a link with all of the details. Now for today's episode, it's an incredible privilege to introduce Tracee Stanley. Tracee is the author of the best-selling book, Radiant Rest, Yoga Nidra for Deep Relaxation and Awakened Clarity. Her forthcoming book, titled The Luminous Self, Sacred Yogic Practices and Rituals to Remember Who You Are, is also scheduled to be released with Shambala Publications in October of this year. Tracee is the founder of Empowered Life Circle, a sacred community and portal of practices, rituals, and tantric teachings inspired by more than 20 years of study in Sri Vidya Tantra and the teachings of the Himalayan Masters. As a post-lineage teacher, Tracee is devoted to sharing the wisdom of Yoga Nidra, rest, meditation, self-inquiry, nature as a teacher, and ancestor reverence. She's gifted in illuminating the magic and power found in liminal space and weaving devotion and practice into daily life. There is so much practical wisdom woven throughout this episode, and I'm so grateful to share it with you. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Tracee, welcome to the podcast. It's a huge honor to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate being here, Mary.
Of course. I really value this whole conversation around rest. And I think it's something that inherently we all understand the value of and know how important it is. And yet it can be so hard to give ourselves that permission and to feel like we have the time. So as a starting point, I was hoping you could share a bit about what your journey has been with rest and what led you to the practice of Yoga Nidra.
Those are great questions. So let's see. I was practicing yoga right at the same time that I started a career in Hollywood as a film producer. And as you probably can guess, those days are very long. There's lots of crisis that happens all the time. There's lots of exhaustion. There was a lot of competitiveness as well. And what I started to realize was that I was running on empty. I definitely felt like I was running on empty. But luckily, because I was practicing yoga at the same time, I was introduced to this practice of Yoga Nidra, just really kind of randomly in a class one day where the teacher just told everybody at the end, lay down, and I'm going to guide you through this practice. And I was like, wow, there's something magical about this practice. Like I feel renewed and rejuvenated. And so I would just kind of seek out the practice whenever I could. And I started studying with this particular teacher. And the way that he would teach his yoga classes was that the asana, the physical portion of the class would be, probably 3/4 of the class. And the last portion of the class was Yoga Nidra, or what I was thinking at the time was kind of like an extended Shavasana or body scan happening. And I think that for me, what I started to realize was that, oh, I actually have more energy. I'm more clear. I'm more able to be creative, to put together quick solutions to problems that might have taken me longer to do before. And that I actually was able to remain more calm and centered. And so eventually I actually started teaching yoga, opened a yoga studio while I was also producing films. And I would always have people asking, how is it that you stay so calm? And then eventually I started to try to infuse a little bit of the yoga practices into my work and into, the film sets. And I noticed the difference when people actually had moments to be able to just, even if it was 5 minutes, to just pause, reset, and kind of come back to a place within them that is always resting, and to remember that how important it is. And I do think that, you mentioned that we all know how important rest is. And I think that in society, most of the time we know how important sleep is, but we don't really know how important it is to have intentional rest that is separate from the sleeping that we do, however many hours we do that.
Yes, that's so true. I'm really glad that you make that distinction. And, it's interesting to hear about how it was just even those 5-minute breaks on the film set or within the workday, because that was something that really stood out to me in your book is you talk about the householder flow and for people who are living these really busy lives. And I think that that is often the big challenge that I hear people speak about is just feeling like there isn't the time. So is there an amount that you would recommend that people need in order to get that nice dose of rest to feel rejuvenated and recharged?
I think that when you start with just a couple of minutes of laying down, and let's just say you lay down for 2 minutes, you're reclaiming something for yourself. And I think a lot of times when we think about the idea that I don't have time, I don't have space, we don't actually realize how much rejuvenation we can get in such a very short period of time. And I also think that what happens when we reclaim our rest, even in those small doses, is that our relationship with time and space starts to shift, right? Because on the one hand, we could say, what is 2 minutes? I can't rest in 2 minutes. That's not long enough, right? But when you're actually being still and silent and spacious for 2 minutes, it's actually much longer than you think it is. Right.
Yes.
So then you start to look at the time differently. You're like, oh, I have 5 minutes or I have 10 minutes in between clients or in between meetings or in between, waiting for my kid to come out of soccer practice and I'm sitting in the car. I can actually do a rest practice for 10 minutes while I'm waiting. And it starts to shift everything that you see, and it weaves through the day in a much different way.
I love that you bring that up because it's so easy to default to those energy draining activities like scrolling social media in those 2 minutes or doing something that's going to deplete you. But to think that you can reframe your understanding of rest and looking at those 2 minutes as being really valuable. And it really, I was thinking when you were saying that your yoga nidra practice actually started with what you thought was an extended shavasana. I remember going to classes and so many times people would get up before a shavasana because those 2 minutes just felt like too long. And,
Mhm.
just even to think that sometimes in our modern world, the way we even think about those last couple minutes of practice as being too much of a commitment, that unsettledness to need to get up and walk away.
Yeah, so there's two things that I want to pull the thread on. The first is just what you were saying about the reframing. And it's something that I think people can do now if they're listening is to consider what are all the ways in which they waste time, right? Because you talked about the scrolling. So how do we waste time? And if you can make a list of how you waste time, that is like the first step, perhaps, for looking at how you can start to reclaim some of your time back for rest, right? That 5 minutes or 10 minutes that you spend on the phone with someone unnecessarily, or that you're scrolling, or that you're binge watching, whatever it is. And there's no judgment because we all do it. But to be able to become more aware of how we use our time and how our time, if we reclaim it, can actually help us become more healthy. And then I think the other thing, I think that when we think about people and we've all done it, like I don't have time to lay here, my mind is racing, is really going a little bit deeper into that as to do you really believe that you're worthy of rest? Right? Because you've been in this yoga asana class for the last maybe hour or, 75 minutes, however long the class is. And maybe you've worked, quote unquote, really hard in this class. Why would you deny yourself the gift of rest, especially when the Shavasana is the most important posture in the entire class? That's where everything gets to integrate. That's where everything gets to process. That's where you get to finally withdraw your senses inward and really feel and remember who you are. And so Shavasana is a real gift. And the question is, why are you denying yourself the gift?
That is such a big question. And do you think that that is the underlying issue with this kind of hustle culture and burnout culture that we found ourselves in, is a feeling of unworthiness, or that we need to somehow prove ourselves by continuously going and going and going and denying ourselves of rest?
Yes, I definitely think that our worth is tied to what we produce. Right. And I definitely know that as somebody who had a career, my literal job title was producer. Right. So it's like what we produce and what the quality of what we produce somehow has equaled our worth. Right. And we've become detached from so many things that are essential to our health. Right. So if we think about the invention of the light bulb that extended our workday, right? The electricity, the industrial age, all of a sudden we stopped realizing that, okay, the sun is going down. This is like a natural time for us to begin to wind the day down, to rest ourselves, to wake up with the sun. And I think that once we started to kind of become detached from nature, detached from the cycles of the moon, detached from the seasons, we created this illusion that everything was always in process of happening. There was no natural understanding of the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And if we think about that natural cycle and we look at nature, nature has times when it goes fallow. Nature has times when nature is resting, and then it can come back into the full bloom, right? And we've really are denying ourselves that. And we are part of nature. So if we are denying nature, we're also denying ourselves. And I think that that's kind of the core of where the misalignment is. And then, we can go into the media and we can go into how we're socialized to believe that we have to be perfect, right? And perfect means that we have to produce something and that we have to show our value. And, perfect is death. Perfection is actually death. It's like when something is perfect, it's over.
Ah,
So why would we be striving for perfection?
thank you for saying that. I've never heard it described like that, but that is so true. And that is such a common theme that comes up on this podcast and this community with people who struggle with substances. There's also this striving for perfection and this exhausting, relentless pursuit of trying to be perfect and fitting more in the day and achieving more. And so, would you say that the way to kind of disentangle from that mentality and the cultural conditioning and all of that is that returning back to nature?
I think that that's one of the things. Yes. I think that the simple act of even just planting a small garden, like it could just be a patio garden with a few pots and tending to a number of plants. And the key word here is tending, right? Is that if you have that garden, you have to tend, you have to pay attention, you have to be aware. And then your awareness actually starts to become more sharp, where you start to notice, oh, there's something different happening in this plant than was happening in the morning, that's happening in the evening. And then I can start to look to see, how does that reflect in my own life, right? How does that reflect in not only just the seasons of my life and me accepting the seasons of my life, as opposed to having this illusion or buying into, what dominant culture wants us to believe, that there are no seasons of our life, but that there are actually natural cycles during our day. I have certain parts of my day where I'm more creative. I have other parts of my day that are that I should be maybe resting or doing something a little bit more inward, right? And then if I can start to see those cycles within myself and that are natural to me, then I don't judge myself as much for not being the same as Susie, who gets up at 7 in the morning and does her morning run, or whatever it is that I'm comparing myself to, right? It's like nature doesn't compare itself to anyone or anything. Nature is, and it is in its own right, beautiful and unique and wonderful. And I think the more that we start to reclaim our own inner nature, we can also start to reclaim our worthiness. And we all have a birthright to thrive, and rest is essential to thriving.
Absolutely. I love that you speak about observing your own garden because it is so true. You would never sit there and judge the growth of a garden or compare one pot of flowers to the other. And it also makes me think of, I've heard Gabor Mate speaking about our culture and some of the problematic aspects of our culture which cause disease and illnesses. We wouldn't necessarily blame the flower. Also, if it wasn't growing properly, we would look at the conditions and how it's being watered and the amount of sunlight. I just feel like the analogy that you just gave is like it could just grow and grow.
We could definitely talk about this for a long time, because at the same time, if you had one flower that was your favorite and then another flower pot that was also growing equally as beautifully, you wouldn't decide to give one more water,
Mm.
right? So why would you deny yourself the water of life?
Ah.
And I think for each of us, we have to decide, because you talked about the conditions, we have to decide, what is the water of our life? What is the thing that gives us the juice, the thriving, the beauty? It's not the same for everyone, nor should it be, because we're all unique beings. And I think we're here to express our uniqueness. And when we are forced in some way from outside conditions, a dominant culture, to try to fit into a box, that causes us pain and suffering.
Right. And so as you were coming to these realizations yourself and, with all of the students that you've worked around this, how do you navigate the friction when you're starting to have these inner realizations, but you're still living in a culture that is trying so hard to make you compare and make you work harder? And I think that's the thing that a lot of us come up against. It's like, okay, I'm starting to have these realizations, but not everyone else is on board with this. So how do you navigate
Yeah,
that?
that's such a good question. And it's interesting that you mentioned this word friction, because friction in yoga is also known as this heat of tapas, right? And tapas is this friction that happens when we go against the grain of our old habits. And we could also say that when, and I'm extrapolating now, it doesn't say this in the text, but I think we can also say that it's the friction that happens when you go against the grain of dominant culture, when you go against the grain of society, when you go against the grain of what the trend is. And, the idea that the people want to invoke FOMO in you, right? Or they want to invoke competition in you, and that you go against the grains of those things. And it does create a friction. And that friction is what's said to kind of make us radiant. It's the friction that kind of melts the illusion of personality and brings us back to the true self, of the true nature of who we really are. And we can say that and it sounds really, like very nice and lovely and spiritual, but when we try to bring it into real life, it's not easy, because it does mean that you have to look at your life and you have to look at what is going back to the conditions. What are the conditions that are causing me pain and suffering? Who are the people that may be in my circle that have been close but are not healthy for me? What are the things that I'm doing that might not be healthy for me? And how can I start to slowly begin to just notice how I can start to maybe shift the conditions so that it makes it a little bit more easeful for me to have some space between the conditions that are causing me suffering and the direction that I might be moving in now. And, when you start to shift your awareness, I do think that relationships fall away. When you start to
Absolutely.
heal, that can happen.
Yeah. And that's something that comes up a lot also, in the conversation. We talk a lot on this podcast about moving away from harmful substances and having to come to realize that a lot of the past behaviors and people that have been in your life have not necessarily been for your greater good. And, that's being part of the process. And one question I had as you were talking about this idea of, I love what you said about how that friction can actually like lead you towards your radiance. And so how do you not get stuck in the struggle, in the period of feeling like you're always fighting for getting there and feeling
Mm.
like you're always kind of up against, do you know what I mean by that?
I totally know what you mean. And we need to be real. You are definitely going to get stuck, right? You're going to get stuck. You're going to forget, but then you're going to remember. And then you're going to forget again, and you're going to remember. And so it's not a linear process. That I believe that healing and becoming more aware is really more of a circular, maybe sometimes squiggly lined process. And I think if we accept that it's a nonlinear, then that helps us to create space within us to be able to accept that there's going to be ebbs and flows. And at the same time, I also think that community is so important in healing because we need reflections on our journey, and we need like-minded people who are there, who maybe some of them have experienced what we've experienced, and they can be there to hold us, and then we can also be there to hold someone else on their journey. But I think community is really important for the reflections that it brings. I think that it's, even if it's one person or two people, or it could be a whole community of, hundreds of people. And so the struggle is going to be the struggle. And I think if we reframe the idea or even the word struggle and we shift it to something like journey, then we know that the journey is going to have arduous parts of it. And that the more that we reclaim our worthiness and the more that we try to release ourselves from perfection, the more we know that we can go slow. It's like if you're walking up a hill, or you're going on a 2-mile hike, and all of a sudden you come up to a hill, you're at 12,000 feet elevation. And I'm saying this because I have a friend who just sent me a video from Peru, and she was at 12,000 feet elevation, and she's a very avid hiker, but it really got to her because she wasn't used to the elevation. And it's like, oh, I have to slow down. I'm going to slow down. I'm going to start to be aware. What's happening in my body right now? What's happening even in my mind as I'm starting to walk up and I know I have another hour of this before I get to the top of Machu Picchu or wherever I am. So we think about it as a journey, as a pilgrimage. And I think if we can honor ourselves to know that there will be ebbs and flows, and we need to give ourselves grace. And if we give ourselves grace, then I feel like there's a little bit more space for all of what we might experience.
Yes. That's so powerful. It always amazes me how much of a shift language can create. And I think journey is so important too, because it takes us out of the mindset that we're just going to be fixed, I think, or that on the other side of the struggle, everything is going to be perfect. When, like you said, it really is a journey through this, and there isn't an end point. And actually that can be a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it can be a beautiful thing, because if we are aware while we're on the journey, we have the gems then to share with others who need our wisdom And we leave the journey, maybe one kind of chapter of the journey with this kind of embodied wisdom, and then there's another journey because it's not going to be complete until it is.
Absolutely. And so, in terms of the tools, I know that Yoga Nidra has been a very big practice for you, of course, and a big part of your teaching and what you offer others. And I would love if you could share for anyone who doesn't know what Yoga Nidra is, can you help understand the practice and some of the ancient origins?
That is a wonderful question. Yoga Nidra is known as a few different things. I think that most of the time in Western culture, when we're talking about Yoga Nidra, people are thinking of the technique, right? And the Yoga Nidra would be then a technique of systematic deep relaxation that guides you deeper through the states of consciousness, being waking, dreaming, deep sleep. And then there is a fourth state, which is known as Turiya, which is said to be this place that is like a void that is both empty and kind of full of infinite potential. It's a place that is peace beyond words and can really not be described, right? It's a place of complete and total non-doing. And so that's the technique that leads to the state of consciousness that is Yoga Nidra, which is this place that is said to be peace beyond words and a complete and total non-doing. And just as we talked about the idea of healing not being a linear process, Yoga Nidra, even though we're talking about the states of consciousness and we're talking about this journey that takes you deeper inward, it is also not a linear practice. Right. So a lot of times people will come into class and think, oh, it's like a 1, 2, 3. It's like, no, this is a complete non-doing. And each of us has constriction and tension in the body in different places, that there may be also trauma. There could be memories, things that come forward. And each of us is going to have a different experience, even though we might be guided in the same Yoga Nidra practice in the same class. The other thing that sometimes is not mentioned is that Yoga Nidra is also known as a goddess. And she is talked about in the text, the Devi Mahatma, and there are many different stories about Yoga Nidra. But the thing that I think kind of unites all of these various stories is that Yoga Nidra as a goddess is this kind of radiant being that exudes this cool kind of moonlight quality, and she is nurturing and she has the power of repose. So her Shakti, or her power, is this power of deep dreamless sleep, this place where we can enter the void. And so if we think about Yoga Nidra, I would say that Yoga Nidra is a practice that allows us to remain awake and aware as we move through the states of consciousness, the waking state, the dream, the deep sleep, the Turiya. And that as we are awake and aware in that state, that we remember who we truly are. And so Yoga Nidra kind of connects us to this place within us that is always at rest and that knows it is worthy of rest. And so I really feel like for anyone, Yoga Nidra is a really healing practice because it helps us to release, or to at least learn little by little to release all the doings and to know that we are worthy of resting in grace.
So beautiful. And it's so important, I think, to recognize that it does give you access to that part of yourself. Something that I've heard you share about before is how a lot of your writing in your book came directly out of Yoga Nidra, right? And it's almost as if you were channeling it through your practice. And that to me felt like enough inspiration in itself for everybody to want to be able to do this practice, to know that a beautiful book could flow out of that practice. And I was hoping you could share more about that and what the connection is between Yoga Nidra and creativity.
Yes. So we can talk about the states of consciousness, which we just kind of went through, but then we can also think about the brainwave states, right? And so the brainwave states, let's say right now, maybe if people are listening and they're just relaxing and listening to this, you might be more in a kind of low beta brainwave, right? Because you're a little bit more relaxed, but you're still receiving information, you're still awake and aware. And if I were to ask you to slowly start to begin to notice how you are breathing without any judgment, and to maybe close your eyes or soften your gaze and start to bring your awareness inward to the sound of your breath or the sound of your heartbeat, we might start to move more into an alpha brainwave state, which is where we're moving our awareness from being external to internal. And at some point, if you started to become kind of deeply relaxed, like say we started to move into a deep relaxation technique, which is part of Yoga Nidra, you're starting to move into this theta state, right? And this theta state is a state of deep relaxation. It's a state of dreaming while you're sleeping, maybe even daydreaming, right? It's this like watery kind of space. And then you start to perhaps move into a deeper state, which is the delta state. And that delta state is the place where healing can occur. And so as we move through these different states, and again, it's non-linear, remembering that the delta state is also the place where all external awareness is completely cut off, right? So if you were in a drug-induced coma, or if you were getting anesthesia, all of your external awareness is cut off. You're on the operating table. You're not going to, hopefully, be able to remember or hear what the surgeons are saying while you're in surgery, right? But there have been experiments that have been done with different, what they would have called at that time, yoga masters, where they hooked them up to these EEG machines. And they basically were testing and observing their brainwave functions while they were practicing Yoga Nidra. And what they noticed was that these masters were able to go into this state of delta and actually be able to talk about what was being said while they were in the delta state, and while the scientists were observing that it looked like, by all accounts, they were in a deep, deep sleep and all external awareness had released. And so most of us will not really get to that delta state, and maybe we will, maybe we won't, but we definitely, in that deep relaxation space, can move into the theta brainwaves. And the theta brainwaves are where creativity is born. It's where intuition is born. And so to think that each one of us has this opportunity just through the practice of deep relaxation to be able to access more of our intuition and more of our creativity, that's where that comes from, right? So, as an experiment for myself years ago, before I even thought about writing, I had read about Swami Vedabharati, who's one of the teachers in the Himalayan tradition that I study. And he talked about creativity and this practice of deep relaxation and Yoga Nidra. And I found it to be true, that I was more creative. I could write, I could come up with solutions. And so I think that when we think about it in a scientific way, maybe it's also easier to understand that we all have access to this. We all have access to this. And, some people will find deep relaxation practicing Yoga Nidra. Some will maybe find it in nature, right? Going on long, beautiful walks. And so, again, it's finding that water of our life, right? It's like, what is the creative juice for our life? And also knowing what are the things that block our creativity? What are the things that block the juiciness of our life? And being able to start to create, again, the spaciousness away from those things, knowing that it's going to create friction and it's going to create a little bit of discomfort, but it also has the possibility, again, of creating that radiance.
And are there things in your practice that you realized Yoga Nidra, you've spoken, has of course helped you tap into that creative source? Are there things that have fallen away in your life through this practice that you've just recognized are blocking the creativity and preventing you from tapping into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that social media is one of those things. I became very aware of my use of social media, and I would even say kind of consumption of social media. So a lot of times during the year, and we talked about seasons, right? I'll have seasons of no social media where I'll take a 6-week break off of social media, right? And then we get to look at, when you do that, you get to look at, oh, it's interesting how social media then will punish you for not being on the platform. And so here comes the friction, right? So now the friction, this is like my perfect practice of self-study, where I get to look at, oh, let me see how the ego comes in, right? And wants to not have that consequence of, the whatever algorithms, whatever is happening. And then let me go deeper into that to feel in and really understand, what is that about and how can I start to dismantle that? Because when I dismantle that through the practice of self-study, then I become more free. Then I become liberated. And
Yes.
I think we have to do that with everything, right? With that person that we don't want to say, you know what, this person really isn't like let me go deeper and really start to practice some self-inquiry around that. So that's the constant thing of always looking at those pieces.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought up that example because social media has really been designed. I think it's important for people to understand that it's been designed by people who are coming in with an intention of getting you addicted and measuring your worth based on it. And it is so easy for those thoughts to creep in. I need this. This is how I connect to people. And just the inquiry. I mean, that's really the same process that I work with people through when it comes to giving up substances. I need this. It's my source of social connection. It's, all of these stories that we get so wrapped up into. So I love that you bring in that invitation of just asking the questions, and I love this idea of like the friction that it brings up and how that actually is bringing you towards your radiance.
Yeah, I definitely feel like, and I don't feel like, I know this for a fact. It's one of the things that I researched for my new book, is that these advertising companies are basically practicing psychology. These media companies are practicing psychology. They know more about our desires and our unconscious desires than we do. And so spiritual practice, part of it is being able to reveal not only the truth of who we are, but the truth of who we are not, right? And being able to lay down, who am I not, so that I can be free. And I think, just as a small experiment, first of all, we always, I think it's helpful for us to constantly be practicing self-study, to constantly be asking ourselves the hard questions, like the question that I most don't want to ask myself today. Let me ask that question and let me answer it and not judge myself about the answer. And then be supported by my community, be supported by my therapist, be supported by wise ones, elders, to help me kind of move through whatever it is that I find in the answer to those deep inquiries.
Right. Yeah, it really does bring in a lot of opportunity for self-compassion too. When, like you said, you realize some of the external factors that are putting that added pressure, like the psychologists that are kind of potentially working against us in a sense. And so, what came out of those seasons of taking those breaks and giving yourself the space to remove the things that were getting in the way of your creativity?
So much clarity, so much connecting to inner knowing, to connecting to intuition, connecting to courage. Because there's, that constant stream of the feed. I don't know if we realize how much it affects us, you know, not just in how much it makes us feel unworthy, how much it makes us feel not good enough, like we should be doing more, like we have to compete, but also how it directs our action. Whether it's the action of purchasing something that you don't really need, right? Or there's so much to it. And I don't know how long it will take for us to kind of change that system. But I think that we can change the internal system, right? We can dismantle the inner workings that are not true to who we really are. So the creativity, the clarity, just more time to do practice, right? Less concern about things that are not my business,
Right.
right? And just, creating the space to have the life that's important. And so I think that if there's any inspiration at all for someone to just take a day or 2 days or 3 days off of social media, to maybe have like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday where you just don't look at anything and you come back to it on Monday. And the more you do that, the more you will see how much space and freedom, and I would even say joy, that you have. And then the 3 days starts to turn into, oh, it's going to be a week now. And then maybe the week turns into longer. But I do think that there will be increased joy for sure just by getting off of social media.
I'm so glad you bring that up. I think it's so true. And it's something that I think about myself a lot because I hear the voice saying, this is how you've connected with so much of your sober community. There's always the little stories, and just to be able to ask the questions. And in my experience, too, just committing to those breaks, you also notice how often you have the urge to pick up the phone and how much that's, wired into you, that hardwired craving and wanting to just pick it up and pick it up in the little spacious moments too. And really how we can actually insert moments of rest in those spacious moments too.
Yeah, so that's what you get to notice, right? You get to notice the habit of distraction. You get to notice when, and so again, we can go back into this idea of the cycles of our day. We get to notice when and what's happening that makes me want to go to reach for the phone. Right. And then that's a moment of self-study. That's a moment of inquiry. If you can pause in that moment and just consider, oh, what's going on with me right now that I'm feeling like I need to reach for the phone? And can I start to kind of contemplate and discern what is the root of this moment? And that's a practice. That's a way of weaving a practice in. And then you can take some time for rest.
I love this so much because you could basically replace phone in that with drink. And that's, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on how yoga nidra can be supportive in helping people with giving up alcohol or harmful substances and breaking free from addiction. And I just want to say, like, what you just said was so beautiful. Those moments of self-inquiry, if we could just create that pause, just like, whether it's picking up the phone or picking up anything else, how powerful that can be in freeing us from these behaviors.
Yeah, I really think that self-inquiry and self-study and space and pausing are the key to a lot of healing. Right? I can't I have had people in my life who have suffered from addiction, and some who continue to be in addiction. And what I have noticed is that when they're able to pause and observe, that there creates a little bit of disentanglement, right? And so I'm not an expert in sobriety, but I do know and I do feel that yoga nidra creates the peace within that doesn't come from anything external. The Yoga Sutras talk about this place within us that is an eternal, effulgent, radiant place. And it is known as this place that is beyond all sorrow, deep within our heart. And that place that is beyond all sorrow is beyond all conditioning. And it's the truth of who we really are. And so if we can imagine or even just trust or have faith that there is a part of us that is untouched by all conditions and all experiences, that remains eternal and bright, and that when we rest and then when we pause, that we can touch that place, that we can remember that place, then I think that we all have the power to heal.
So beautiful. It's that forgetting of who we are in the covering, right? That, you know, I know you speak in your book about the koshas and these layers that, you know, cover that true essence of who we are. And it's so powerful to think about how these practices can bring us back to that.
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is that the psychology of all the media that we were talking about earlier is designed for you to forget. It is designed for you to create more layers over the covering of the brightness of your soul. And I believe that we are here to remember who we are. And that once we remember who we are, even if it's just for a split second, first of all, that carries with you for your entire life. But then you can also help to shine light for other people, right? Because we get to see a little bit like, oh, I see a little bit of that light. Can I reflect the light back to this person? That's why community is so beautiful, because community is that mirror that can
Yeah.
reflect your light back to you when you can't see it.
Yes. Yeah, I think community, you know, sometimes I've found that I just want to like retreat back and do this work on my own. I've caught myself in these patterns of just wanting to, I'll come out when I'm perfect. But it's really to be able to be in that space where people can reflect back to you and vice versa that I've found has been so powerful. And also just being willing to look at those parts of myself, I find naturally creates so much more compassion and compassionate questioning with other people. When you see, you know, when behaviors that trigger me or like behaviors that I don't necessarily agree with, kind of questioning what some of the conditioning and the layers are that are leading someone to engage with life in that way.
Yeah. And, I think that it's really important to think about compassion as the container that can hold all of this healing. I don't know that real, true, deep healing can be possible without not only compassion for self, but compassion for others, even the ones that you have to cut loose. You have to have the compassion. And so that's not an easy practice. You had the word struggle just like a few minutes ago, and we kind of reframed that to journey. And so we can think about, what is the journey of self-compassion? That journey of self-compassion is going to have its ebbs and flows, right? Because we've been conditioned by society to judge, to not only judge others. I mean, we're seeing this right now just in the political climate and everything else that's happening in the world. but we want to judge. And not only do we want to judge, but we want to be the judge and the executioner. We want to be the punisher, right? And so we do that to others, and then we also do it to ourselves. There's nothing that you're doing to someone else in the world that you're not also doing to yourself.
Right.
They're not separate.
Where do you think that comes from, that want to be the punisher and to feel like we need to punish other people?
I actually think it comes from ego, right? And when we're in the highest place of ego, we may think that we are similar to God, right? And I think that a lot of times we can think of God as a punishing God, as a fearful God. I know for me, when I was growing up, my grandmother was a preacher. She was the daughter of two preachers, and God was something to fear. He was judging, and there was punishment, right? And so I do think that it ties back to this ultimate ego of thinking that you somehow have this almighty power that is similar to what we learned in Sunday school.
Wow, I've never heard it explained like that, but that is such a good point. And it really does come from such an elevated ego place, a godlike place, like you said.
Yeah. And it comes from control, and it comes from fear. Right. At the end of the day, it comes from we can boil it down to fear. And if we boil it down to fear, we can also say that what is the fear of? Is it the fear of your own death? And that somehow you think that controlling and judging and punishing other people is going to keep you from alive, to keep you eternal in some way, even if it's just your legacy.
And so then is the way to work through that to be more accepting of that reality of your own death? Or what would be the way to bring yourself back down from that place of ego and judgment and coming back to a place of more compassionate understanding?
Yeah, the Yoga Sutras speak about these 5 seeds of suffering. One of them is ego. The others are attachment, aversion, fear of death, and clinging. And so I think that we really have to practice self-study. We really have to be willing to dismantle it's not to say that you don't want to have an ego. Like, neither one of us would be sitting here talking right now if we didn't have a healthy ego, right? But what's the dark side of your ego? And start to dismantle that a little bit, I think is good. The other piece about death is that we're all afraid of death. What are we willing to do to pretend that we're not dying? You and I are closer to death than we were when we started this podcast an hour ago. And that's a reality that we all have to face. And this takes me back to the garden, because the more that we're connected with nature, the more we see the natural cycle of life, and the more we can be in acceptance of the natural cycle of life, and we can see the beauty in it.
There really is so many important lessons in nature. And I'm glad that you bring that up, because I think that it's something I've actually thought about a lot in my own experience with grief, is that we don't look at that part of the human experience. Unlike nature, where we just accept that as normal, you don't really confront it until it's right there in your lived experience and you're going through it yourself. And so I think it's really important that you bring that up and that we all take time to contemplate that. And I know some of the oldest, healing traditions and spiritual practices. Like, I've been on a Buddhist meditation retreat where we spent a lot of time contemplating death, and that was a big part of the practice. And I think that we need to actually be more willing to confront that part of the human experience. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you for also bringing up grief, right? Because this is something that I think we're all struggling with, especially with what has occurred in the last 3 years. But we don't have any rituals for grief, right? Most of our cultural rituals have been eliminated, lost, forgotten, regardless of what culture you come from. I mean, there are some indigenous people who still have those those rituals intact, but most of us in the West, yes, we have the funeral. Maybe we have a sitting of Shiva. Maybe we have some other thing that we do, the Day of the Dead, but there's not a real rite of passage around facing death and honoring grief. It's like you get the 3-day bereavement for, whatever. Maybe you're lucky if you get a free plane ticket. But as a culture, we don't really have. So we have to reclaim these rituals or create our own rituals or remember our rituals of grieving around death so that it can be more accepted as a natural course of life.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think your upcoming book is about rituals. Am I right about that? I don't know how much you're speaking about your upcoming book, but I definitely wanted to open up the space for you to share as much as you'd be willing to, because given how much I benefited from your book, Radiant Rest, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that.
Oh, thank you for asking. So my new book is called The Luminous Self: Sacred Yoga Practices and Rituals for Remembering Who You Really Are. And so a lot of it is actually what we talked about, right? There are practices and rituals that I have done over time that I have either kind of downloaded, I've been given, I've studied over years that have helped me to kind of peel back the layers of who I am not more towards who I am so that I can live more fully into my truth. And so we explore the kleshas that we just talked about, those seeds of suffering. We explore death. We explore dreams. We explore all of these different things that that are like portals to remembering who we are so that we can have a taste maybe of our true nature, a glimpse of our light, and that we can hold on to that to help us through our journey, through the ebbs and flows of life. Yeah.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to that. You know, every time the word struggle pops up in my head now, I'm going to be reframing that towards journey. And yeah, I think this idea of having these sacred rituals is just so important. And I want to thank you so much for everything that you've shared in this conversation. It's been really, really beneficial. And I know that people are going to want to continue to learn more from you and know where they can find you. So is there anything that you'd like people to know about in terms of offerings or where they can connect with you?
Yeah. So to connect with me, you could first, if you'd like, you can go to my website, which is traceestanley.com. And Tracee is with 2 E's. I also have a free 14-day deep relaxation course on commune. So you could check out the course on commune. It's on my website. I think it's on the homepage of my website. But you can check that out as a way to discover these 5 practices that I'm offering and just see if these practices resonate with you. My book is also available. My first book is called Radiant Rest: Yoga Nidra for Deep Relaxation and Awakened Clarity. You can find it everywhere books are sold. What else can I tell you? I think that that's pretty much the portals to find out where I am. And I'm also on Instagram and not really on Facebook, but hopefully we can connect at some point somewhere in the ethers and rest together.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to be sure to link all of that in the show notes. And I just want to say how much I appreciate this time to connect with you and all of the beautiful offerings that you're putting out into the world. I find that rest is needed now more than ever. So thank you.
Been an honor. So glad to have been with you and your community today.